Evan, thanks so much for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So you're a very busy man. Lots of different companies that you've started, a book, book that you've written. I'd love to start with your book, Regulatory Hacking, because I've read it recently, and it was written in 2018. And I'm curious, when the pandemic hit, if you thought about re-releasing it with the tagline of "I told you so."
The temptation was there, but what's actually been great, honestly, is I get probably every week an email from, some entrepreneur somewhere in the world who's, read the book and is putting the ideas into practice, asking for advice and guidance, and the sort of creativity and the kind of potential impact of the different ideas that people are working on. And if the book helped them in any way or inspired them in any way or gave them a better playbook, like that's deeply fulfilling from my standpoint.
What lit the fire under you to write that book? What was the inspiration?
I had this incredibly, just incredible opportunity when I was, building and running 1776 with my co-founder Donna, to just get to work with these incredible entrepreneurs. And the focus of 1776 really was on what I would now call kind of regulatory hacking startups, but it was startups who were attempting to apply the kind of classic Silicon Valley startup playbook to these really gnarly, hard public interest problems. How do we make our schools more effective at educating all children? How do we improve public health, and how do we improve personalized medicine? How do we make government more responsive and help citizens to engage more in their communities? All of these sort of climate change, right? Like really difficult, gnarly problems. And over time, what we started to figure out is that, there was this incredible wealth of material available out there online, right? You could go read the essays of Paul Graham. You could go get, all these incredible materials from YC or 500 Startups or First Round Capital, all this great stuff, about how you build startups in a regular context, right? I want to build a new app to date, or I want to build a way to kind of get food delivered to me, whatever it is. But that when you tried to apply that playbook to these really hard, gnarly public interest problems, it often broke down because you had to navigate and deal with government, right? Either because government was setting the rules of the game and driving incentives, and you had to in some way change the rules or create new incentives, or because in some cases, literally, government was your customer, right? You had to figure out how to sell to government. And the Silicon Valley playbook actually often gives you wrong ideas about how to do that. And so the book kind of came from what I learned really from these incredible entrepreneurs. And I tried to kind of craft it together into, a real guide and some kind of generic principles that you could apply to these problems.
They're great. I especially love the concept of the power map, and I think that's also a great example where it doesn't have to just apply to a regulatory environment. I think stepping back from just your ideal persona and your user personas and really like figuring out the whole flow of power and influence is huge. I'd love you to expand a little bit on power maps.
Yeah. So there's a tendency, I think, when I use the phrase sort of Silicon Valley, I don't literally mean, a couple of counties south of San Francisco in the Bay Area. I mean more of kind of a mindset or an attitude, right? A network of people who tweet at each other a lot, right? Like between VCs and a certain set of founders. And
a large echo chamber,
very large echo
in many
chamber,
different cities.
There's often a sort of mindset still to this day, right? Even after everything we've been through over the last 2 years, and there's often a mindset that anything that imposes any constraint on an entrepreneur's ability to kind of build some new thing is bad, right? And I always refer to it as a certain Ayn Randian, except they never grew and evolved from being 15 and reading Ayn Rand, and kind of mindset, right? Where it's sort of this very simplistic libertarianism. Whereas that's just not reality. And that mindset often goes, oh my God, insiders are stacking the game against me. And you go, well, yeah, to some extent, maybe. And there is absolutely regulatory capture, and there's rent seeking, and there's lots of bad behavior that goes on. But the basic premise that, we live in a democracy, and in a healthy, well-functioning democracy, and I'd be the first to say we're not always there in America, but that's the aspiration, right? In a healthy, well-functioning democracy, policymakers are supposed to listen to various stakeholders and groups and craft rules that make sure that markets operate in the public interest. Right? That's how it's supposed to work. And as a business, or as a collection of businesses, as citizens, as collections of citizens, we have a right to assemble and communicate and to petition government and communicate to them what it is that we need. And inevitably, when I was advising startups at 1776, or even now, in our venture portfolio or companies I've invested in as an angel, they almost always start from a place of not remotely understanding the game that they're playing. And that's not a bad thing, right? They're often coming at these industries as outsiders with really cool, big, new, disruptive ideas. And that's great. But any one of these industries, healthcare, education, transportation, anything involving energy or climate change, government services, right? These are very sophisticated markets. There are people who are currently very involved in setting the rules, and some of those people really are operating earnestly in the public interest, even if you might disagree with them. Some are not. Some are pursuing their own private special interest, right? That's the game. If you don't understand that game, if you don't understand what the chessboard looks like, if you don't understand who the players are and what their interests are and what their capabilities are, you are at a massive disadvantage. And no amount of, but I have a better idea, but if you just do this, everything will be great, is going to get you there. And that's the basic premise of the power map, right? You have to understand the game you're playing and where the chess pieces lie and what those chess pieces can and can't do.
That makes a lot of sense. And I feel like there's a very natural pattern where people just tend to steer clear of it, right? So if you're trying to do something innovative or disruptive and you keep hitting these roadblocks, you just steer clear of it. You go a different direction, right? And so then these hard problems never really get solved.
I think there's been, I would say 5-6 years ago, you were still 6-7 years ago, you were still at a place where people just steered clear. I remember, or thought they were steering clear, right? They didn't want to operate. VCs didn't want to fund startups that were operating in markets where there were sort of gatekeepers and where politics could get in the way. And I remember this. I think I cite this in the book, but this really it still sticks in my head. I was down at South by Southwest, and I was at this sort of private VC dinner, and I'm sitting next to, it was a New York VC, but a pretty prominent New York VC. And I was kind of explaining a lot of the premise of around 1776, right? We help startups who are trying to solve these big public interest challenges and help them navigate government. And he goes, we would never invest in a startup that has regulatory risk. I kind of look at him. I'm like, really? And he's like, yeah. We just don't want to deal with that. We don't want to deal with gatekeepers. We want startups that can, win on the merits. And then he pauses and he goes, well, we did invest in this one startup that's sending drones flying through cities to do LiDAR scans of everything in the city for targeting outdoor advertising more effectively. And I'm kind of looking at him and he goes, well, I guess there might be some regulatory risk in that one. And I'm like,
one would think.
Yeah, but there was still this mindset that you tried to avoid regulatory risk. Then I think you went through a wave where, Uber was incredibly successful early on, right? In kind of going after this really classic rent-seeing regulatory capture behavior in all these cities around the world. And again, I have this really poignant memory of having a conversation in Silicon Valley with another different, very prominent VC, and I was once again explaining the premise of what we do, and he goes, "Oh, why do you have to do any of that? Uber has demonstrated that if you just stack up enough capital, you can just roll government." And I was like, And literally what was going through my head at the time was, you're assuming that the Uber story is over, right? You're assuming that it just doesn't take a while for government to kind of catch up to what's happening here. But even so, Uber was such and I talk about this a lot in the book, Uber was such an incredibly unique outlier, right? In terms of the particular industry they were in, the dynamics in that, what they were bringing to it, that just don't apply, right? It doesn't apply. It didn't apply if you were 23andMe and you were just going to decide that the FDA shouldn't have a say in offering home DNA testing, right? Which didn't end well, almost killed 23andMe, right? And they had to take a major step back and understand their power map and build relationships, and it took them a 3-4 year arc before they could actually start offering, health advice based on their home DNA tests, right? They had to kind of, feed off the land for a long time off of just doing sort of ancestry and all of this kind of stuff, because they didn't understand that the FDA is a very, very different beast than, say, thousands of local taxi cab commissions in cities all around the world, right? Or an extreme version would be like a Theranos, right? Like eventually fake it till you make it when it involves blood testing that people are relying upon to make life or death decisions is going to end tremendously badly, right? You really need to be on your game if you're doing that stuff.
Yeah, because it's, when, the trial's going on now, and when you see everything that happened in their playbook, I've been in software a long time. It's pretty much what I've seen every software vendor do, right? It was nothing new to me whatsoever. But when it's applied to when lives are on the line, it's a big problem. I think what I love, in addition to your whole focus on truly understanding it and the power map, and then also it can be influenced, right? It serves people, and you can navigate it. But also your concept of, this work doesn't have to just live in the valley. It can live closer to where the problem is, where the frontline workers are. And I had an aha moment when I was reading your book, because I'm always telling my clients we need to do more day in the life of the users, right? We need to do more site visits. But when I thought about regulatory environments, there's usually multi-generational families that work in those regulatory environments. And not just that, but communities built out around a lot of, like, aviation or petroleum. And I was like, geez, how the hell do you do a day in the life for an entire community of multiple generations of expertise? Yeah. So, why not move it there? And I'd love to hear, some of your stories around, moving the work to where the problem is and really embracing that culture.
Well, yes. The most extreme version of that for me, which has been a tremendous success story, certainly as investors in the 1776 venture fund, is, we were the very first checks into a startup in East Africa that was transforming and has transformed, frankly, food logistics, supply chain, food supply in sub-Saharan Africa, predominantly so far in East Africa, but kind of expanding across the continent. Like, when we invested in them, they had not yet built any technology, and they were delivering bananas to mamambogas, to street vendors in tuk-tuks from one shipping container they had set up in one estate, basically a neighborhood in Nairobi. And but they laid out the depth of knowledge and understanding they had about how massive the markets for fresh fruits and vegetables and fast-moving consumer goods in sub-Saharan Africa was, how deeply inefficient and broken that market was, exactly where the leverage points were in order to transform that market, what needed to happen. And I remember, talking to these entrepreneurs, to Grant Brook and to Peter Njojo, and was just blown away. And every single question I asked, but how do you deal with that? How do you deal with that? They had this incredibly vivid story, and they're like, well, we were just out, negotiating with the families that sell pineapples in this region of Kenya, or we were just dealing with, police officials in this region who were trying to do bribes on this access to this market, or we were just dealing with, and we ended up investing in them before they'd ever built any technology, because the understanding of the problem and how messy and frankly dirty and hard this problem was just blow us away. And they've gone on now to raise $60-70 million at increasingly impressive valuations from people like Goldman Sachs and others, and are really transforming that market, right? Like there's no amount of Washington, D.C. or Silicon Valley do-gooderism that could ever possibly replicate the on-the-ground knowledge that you have. And this is like a $800 billion market, right? Like massive market.
Wow.
Take that extreme version, you can apply it to any one of these industries, right? It's if you want to apply the blockchain to, I don't know, the petroleum industry, or if you have an idea for getting to net zero on extraction of carbon fuels, quickly, whatever it is, you're probably gonna go be a member of Capital Factory in Texas, and in particular in Houston, right? It's just gonna be hard, sitting in New York or the Bay Area to really understand how you apply that concept. If you really want to do interesting, transformative things in, precision agriculture and producing healthier food at lower carbon impact or lower water consumption, right? Like you probably have a lot of benefits being a startup in Idaho and in Boise, which has a great, vibrant startup ecosystem, right? And I think that element of as we broaden our imagination on the sectors that need to be transformed, and we maybe get a little bit more real about where the really big problems in our society lie, that we need to be applying entrepreneurship and capital and technology to go solve, it starts becoming really obvious that there's a lot more interesting places that you should be building these companies, or that you can access and tap into. To your point, in many cases, multi-generational depth of knowledge and insight and expertise and regulatory knowledge is a big part of that.
Yeah. When you think about that vast depth of knowledge, it almost feels silly talking about a day in the life, right? And like hiring a SME and doing a few days in the life is not going to even like make a dent in that much knowledge that's out there.
Look, I always say, of all the sectors that I've invested into, or that we supported startups at 1776, like education is always the hardest to sort of get a read on. And the reason it is because every one of us got educated somehow. And many of us went through the public school system and got educated. And if you're an entrepreneur or a technologist, you probably had a somewhat negative experience going through traditional education, right? You tend to have a kind of disruptive authoritarian mindset, and that tends to cause friction in institutional settings, right? So the incredibly large number of entrepreneurs who go, I went to school, therefore I'm an expert in how to transform education. There's very, very, very needed changes that need to happen to improve the quality of public education, right? Absolutely. And I would argue there's almost no problem that's more important to the long-term health of our society than getting that right. But
totally agree.
But like, it's not because the people in there aren't pretty smart and don't care, right? You're not going to rock up going, I went to school, so I have a transformative idea. Or maybe you do have a transformative idea because you went to school, but you got to go to school all over again. You got to really, really go understand, what is it actually like to be a teacher? What is it like to be a school administrator? Like, why do school districts make the decisions that they do, right? Like, what is it like to be a parent? How do you apply your idea to actually make it successfa and to prove outcomes, right? And to actually be able to measure that you are in fact improving outcomes for children and education. And that's a really, really, really high bar for the sort of, hey, I went to school, I have a cool idea, I'm going to go start an ed tech startup.
Yeah, and you're so true that the folks that are in there, they do have great ideas and they do want to change. And we've run plenty of workshops in these types of regulated environments, and it can be a little bit of a bummer because you come up with so many great ideas, and for each idea, there's laundry list of all the reasons why. Oh, that's right, we can't do that because of this, and this. And then I find that they just, sometimes stop there because they've been beaten down so many years. They're like, oh, I guess we won't be able to do any of these ideas.
Well, but back to the point, it doesn't mean you can't do it, but you need to bring a level of sophistication. You got to understand your power map. You got to understand the rules. You have to understand the leverage points. And you have to recognize that, no amount of magical wish fulfillment will make humans other than what they are, right? You hear in ed tech as an extreme version, well, teachers should do this, or parents should do this, or administrators should do this. Why should they do it? Well, because if they did it, my idea would be really easy, or my idea could be so transformative. The trick is, teachers are humans like anybody else, right? They work hard, they're exhausted, they're stressed out, they have way too many things on their plate, right? They want to go home and spend time with, like, at the end of the day, the relevant question is, have you actually gone and done the work? Have you done the day in the life? Do you really, really understand them to understand what teachers in fact will do, not what you think they should do? Same thing with school districts, same thing with administrators. And in some cases, the answer is, well, a teacher's not going to do that because there's this rule. Well, can you change the rule? What would be required to change the rule, right? Why is the rule there in the first place? How do you actually evolve the system to produce better outcomes? And in some cases, introduce new models or new technologies to help make that happen.
Yeah, if more people realize that everyone won't do things exactly the way they expect it and see the world exactly the way they see it, it'd be a much better place to exist in. And maybe that's a good segue into, I'd love to hear a little bit about what you're doing at Helm, and because you are looking at, how can we engage and evolve and leverage civic engagement, right?
Yeah, I mean, you could take a very big through line through a lot of the work that I've done for the last 10, 12 years. And, this sort of concept of being civic-minded, of civic participation, right? If you're an entrepreneur and you care about the world, about your country, you care about people, like there's really big problems you need to go solve. If you want to go solve those problems, in a lot of cases, you're going to have to figure out how to kind of rally people to come support you. While Uber probably took it way too far, like, you do want to give them credit for the beauty of what they figured out early on, which was, I can take an early adopter customer set and I can turn them into a grassroots army to help drive policy changes in cities, right? Like, that was a really, really fascinating insight. And, people like Bradley Tusk, who were advising, Travis Kalanick on the early days, like, so much credit for kind of blending together that sort of Silicon Valley model with a real insights of politics and grassroots and all that stuff. So I've generally been around that, but it's hard to not look at the world right now and go, our democracy is not in a healthy place. And I think it's very easy to kind of come up with simplistic, it's this side's fault or it's that side's fault. And certainly I have a perspective on things that are happening that are particularly damaging to our democracy. But, what we're very, very focused on through Helm is trying to kind of put aside sort of ideology and to the extent that we can, partisanship, and really focus it on the question of what's actually driving a more equitable future in the long term, and how do we help to get more people in their communities, particularly local communities, engaged in doing the work to drive those things that lead to a more equitable future in the long term. For me, given where I'm at, I got a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old. It's hard for me to think of any problem more important to kind of tackle than making sure that they inherit not just a still functioning democracy, but in fact a much healthier one than maybe I inherited. And I think a lot of that has to do with getting people re-engaged in democracy, in politics, in a much healthier way. And I think a lot of that is in local communities. And so we do a lot of that work at Helm. It's both tools, it's data, it's research. So it's a lot of kind of what's really working to say, hey, we want to give everybody organizing superpowers. And we think that work should start first and foremost around issues that kind of impact your day-to-day life, and most of those are local issues.
I love the through line. Yeah, I mean, because with the more engagement, the more understanding, and the more empathy, and the more kind of just, taking responsibility for what it is that we're doing and what it is that we're creating. So I think, it's that same idea of understanding your power map, engaging in it, and just hacking these problems at a local level, and makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's funny. You look at these kind of through lines that maybe you don't understand until they all come together in your head. But at Helm, we talk a lot about the Civic graph, right? We really, really want to understand and model out how influence flows, between and among, the 240 million eligible voters that make up our big, beautiful, messy, crazy democracy. And some of the nodes on that graph, right, are more impactful, right? Some people can literally make a vote in a city council meeting or a state legislature that can change policy, and some people have close influential relationships with those people, right? That Civic graph is not untextured, right, in terms of who has relatively more power and who has relatively more influence over that. Well, actually, in a certain sense, that's just creating the power map, right? Like for everyone, and making it a whole lot easier for lots of different groups, entrepreneurs, but also social entrepreneurs who are trying to drive advocacy and organize people around issues and around policy changes to kind of do that work quicker and more effectively, and be able to sort of engage people, in a more authentic and direct way. I often. One thing we talk a lot about at Helm is this idea that sort of the user experience of democracy isn't particularly good right now, right? And oftentimes, even when you do choose to engage as an individual citizen in the political process, you often feel like you almost get sort of punished for it, right? like in the simplest way, like even when there's a politician that I'm inspired by, that I want to support, and I want to go give them $10 or $25 or a $50 monthly recurring donation or whatever it is. It's like I'm disincentivized to do that because I know that the second I do it, I am going to get spammed every single day for the next 6 months by 250 politicians and causes and issues that I don't care about and I didn't want to support, right? Like really simple things like that. Like it almost trains us to have a really high bar, right? We were doing a lot of user research around sort of super volunteers and local community organizers. And one of the key insights that was coming back is that, even if they're the person who knows their neighborhood the best, right? They're the super organizer for the neighborhood. They know that they don't know all of their neighborhood or anywhere close to it, but they're hesitant to engage too much with people they don't already know because they don't want to get screamed at and they don't want to get yelled at. And they don't want to have these like really nasty, fraught conversations. We think there's a lot that we can do with research and data and technology to create a better user experience and to make democracy more rewarding and fulfilling, and make organizing in our communities more rewarding and fulfilling. So that's a lot of the work that I'm doing right now. But I think it does connect back to a lot of the sort of regulatory hacking work and startups that are operating in the public interest are sort of this interesting subset of just broadly social entrepreneurship and how do we build a better world, a more equitable world.
Yeah, and people are probably asking themselves, is it worth it if I engage? And it's funny that you said the UX of democracy, because I think back to the early days of UX, where we had that era where you had to justify why you would invest in user experience. Like I remember we used to have to like justify, oh, you'll save this number of clicks, or you'll have this less churn or this less training. Is it worth it to focus on the UX? And maybe that's the stage that we're in as a culture. Is it we need to explain why it's worth it to engage in improving that user experience to get that engagement.
I mean, there's a number of things that are sort of true all at the same time, a lot of which are in conflict with each other, right? We had the highest turnout election in 100 years in 2020. Well, that's encouraging in a certain direction. You could look around, you could look around the world right now and like, it would be hard if you're paying attention at all not to recognize that there are some really, really profound challenges, right? In public health, in climate change, right? Like really profound challenges that you cannot solve effectively, I would argue, without sort of democratic engagement in a healthy public sector. It's also true that people are just exhausted and burned out from politics right now, right? And this sort of, a lot of that I think comes back to this sense of like, people know it's important, they are engaging, but the experience is not a pleasant or enjoyable or often directly rewarding one. And so you sort of keep hitting the urgency button, and you keep hitting the, this is the most critical thing ever if you don't do this tomorrow button. But you hit that over and over and over again, and you're also just burning people out and sort of undermining a healthy democracy in the long term. And those are hard problems and really important problems. And I'm just, it's a really great opportunity to get to play a role right now in trying to build something better.
Well, you've inspired me as an entrepreneur, and now with a 4-year-old daughter. I want to solve the important problems. So thank you for the message, and thank you for your time. Something I'd love to finish on is what is the best advice you've ever received?
I took a somewhat non-traditional path. So I built my first startup when I was 19. Raised my first venture capital when I was 19. And eventually left that company when I was about 24. And we went through the dot-com boom, we went through the dot-com bust, got the company stabilized, and then actually got fired by my board, which was a deliciously wonderful lesson at 24. As always, almost all of the great lessons in life were ones that were very humbling at the time. But and I was talking to one of my really close mentors, and I was like, what do I want to do next? Like, do I want to go? I don't really want to go back to school. Like, I don't have a college degree, but what am I going to do? I want to sit in some freshman lecture hall. Like, I've just had this incredible experience and learned all these things. And my mentor, a guy named Fred Bowler, was like, well, you think about Oxford or Cambridge. It's a totally different model. It's not traditional lecture halls. It's reading books and debating, and you'd love that. And then I was like, I just don't know. Do I really want to go? And I applied. I got in, and I was still like, I don't really want to go. And he goes, Evan, you're exceptionally good at convincing people that you're right here at the ripe old age of 24. But if you really want to go do great things in the world, you're going to need to be right more often. And that actually requires reason and logic and study and doing your homework. And that was one of those things that at first almost sounded like a compliment, and then I was like, ooh, that hurt. But it's been true over and over again. And I think it's back to sort of the point you were talking about with power maps and a day in the life and doing your research. Like, almost all of the worthwhile problems to solve are hard problems, right? They're not going to, just get solved because you're clever and you have a vision and you raise some capital, right? They really, really require a level of humility, a level of growth mindset, doing your homework, digging in, really understanding what makes these markets and the people within them tick, and where you can actually add value and where the leverage points are to do something really important and impactful. And that's something I often try to impart to my team at Helm. Right? The more important it is, the harder it is, the more you got to do your homework. But also to a lot of other entrepreneurs who I get a chance to invest in or advise.
That's great advice. You got to be right more often, and being right is not easy. It requires a lot of work.
You got to go to school.
Well, Evan, thank you so much for being here. This was great.
I appreciate it. Thanks a lot, George.